When a dental implant is placed and subjected to immediate chewing forces, it does not sit perfectly still. It vibrates. Bone cells attempting to attach to the titanium surface can tolerate a small amount of the shifting, but the biological tolerance is extremely narrow. If the movement exceeds a threshold of 50 to 150 microns, the bone building process stalls. Instead of forming a structural bond within the bone, the body fills the gap with fibrous connective tissue, a state of clinical failure. Eliminating this micromotion at the microscopic level is essential requirement for long-term implant survival. Total stability is a dynamic evolving equilibrium that changes constantly as the interface between the metal and bone matures. On the day of surgery, the stability is purely mechanical, a result of physical friction between the implant threads and the bone walls. Over the following months, this is replaced by secondary stability created as new bone cells grow directly onto the titanium surface. This stability curve shows a critical window of vulnerability. As the initial frictional stability drops off, biological integration is still in its nascent stages, creating a distant dip in total stability between weeks 2 and 4. Managing this transition determines when a clinician can safely attach a functioning restoration to the implant. On the day 0, the stability of the implant depends entirely on the initial frictional resistance of the bone. This friction is dictated by the density of the site, typically categorized by the Lacombe and Zerb scale of the cortical and trabecular bone proportions. Historically, surgeons relied on their tactile perception during the drilling process to estimate this bone quality. To quantify this grip, clinicians measure the insertion torque value or ITV, which records the rotational force required to seat the implant. However, measuring rotational friction provides an incomplete picture. We must also measure lateral stiffness using resonance frequency analysis, which generates an implant stability quotient or ISQ. A tight rotational grip, a high ITV does not guarantee that the implant has high lateral rigidity. Relying solely on the feel of rotational friction creates a blind spot clinically regarding how the implant will actually respond to side chewing forces. Clinicians often assume that aggressive tapered conical implants are the most effective way to maximize primary stability. A clinical trial by Quizby Lopez and colleagues compared these conical designs directly against standard cylindrical geometries. Data showed a performance gap. Cylindrical implants achieved higher median insertion torque than the conical group. ISQ lateral stiffness measurements followed the exact same trend. Strikingly, surgeons felt they were placing conical implants into softer bone, even though objective metrics proved they were less stable. Objective CBCT scans confirmed the bone density was actually identical between the groups. The aggressive design of the conical implants had simply deceived the surgeon's sense of touch. These results demonstrate why objective measurement tools are required to establish a safe baseline rather than relying on surgical intuition. Following the timeline forward, the implant enters its most vulnerable state between weeks 2 and 4. The physical act of inserting the implant compresses and traumatizes the surrounding bone walls. The body responds by recruiting the osteoclasts to dissolve and receive the traumatized tissue. This cellular resorption actively degrades the mechanical fixation. At the same time, new bone begins to deposit, but this biological fixation is still in its earliest stages. Because biology requires the removal of dead bone before new bone can form. Every implant weakens mechanically before biological fixation takes over. This intersection is the stability dip, the moment where mechanical grip has faded but biological hold has not yet matured. Insertion torque is useless during this phase because it can only be measured once at the moment of surgery. Longitudinal tracking with ISQ is the only way to monitor this window, while torque provides a single data point on the day 0. Weekly ISQ readings allow clinicians to see the depth of the dip and progress of recovery. Attempting early loading without this data leaves the clinician guessing during the implant's highest period of biological risk. These biomechanical metrics dictate which loading protocol is appropriate for a specific case. Immediate loading requires insertion torque over 35 Newton centimeters and an ISQ above 70, securing mechanical stability during biological dip. With lower baseline stability, clinicians shift to early or conventional loading, allowing the implant to reach biological recovery before applying force. These loading protocols represent mathematical response to individual implant's location on the biological stability curve. Improving the implant outcomes requires clinicians to prioritize objective measurements over tactile experience. Subjective feedback and single point torque measurements cannot account for the biological changes occurring in the weeks following the surgery. The goal is to reach full biological integration without ever allowing the implant to shift more than 150 micrometers. Replacing the surgical intuition with rigorous longitudinal tracking provides the only predictable path to long term implant success.